18 animals. That was every last one. A ranch dog named Shep carried something home to a Wyoming property outside Meteetsa, and what scientists pulled from his jaws had already been declared extinct the year before. The entire species had been written off. Every survey, every expert, every official declaration said gone. One dog found what decades of science had missed. John and Lucille Hogg ran a working ranch outside Meteetsa, Wyoming. They were not ecologists. They were not federal surveyors. They were ranchers who knew their land the way you know a room you have slept in for 30 years. One morning in 1981, their dog Shep came home carrying something dead. The Hoggs looked at what he had killed. Neither of them had a name for it. They brought the carcass to a local taxidermist. Extinct, that was the word that came back. The animal in Shep's jaws had been officially declared gone from the earth the year before. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I have spent a long time watching what happens when a bureaucracy decides something is finished. The paperwork gets filed, the surveys stop, the budget goes elsewhere. What the Hoggs held in their hands that morning had not read the paperwork. It had been out there the whole time, hunting, denning, surviving, while the official record said otherwise. Scientists reached Meteetsa and confirmed what Shep had already proven. A colony existed. A working ranch had just rewritten a federal extinction declaration. The colony was small, fragile. Every individual mattered in a way that a healthy population never demands. But the animals were there, and that single fact changed everything downstream. Then, disease moved through the colony. Within a few years, the count had collapsed to almost nothing. By the last wild capture in 1987, biologists were looking at 18 animals, every last one. 18 animals does not sound like a recovery. It sounds like a farewell. And yet, the programme's biologists pulled every one of them from the wild, which meant the wild now held 0. A captive population built from 18 individuals carries an almost impossibly narrow genetic corridor. What those biologists did next with so little is the part I still return to in the field notes. Drive that stretch of Wyoming shortgrass in 1980 and you saw nothing wrong. The grass was there. The sky was there. The silence read as peace rather than absence. I am Dr. Raymond Finch. I have stood in country like that, country that looks intact from a truck window and is hollow underneath. And the hardest thing to communicate is how completely a landscape can lie to you. What the range had lost was not grass. It was the prey base running beneath it. The underground towns, the tunnel networks, the colonies whose poisoning had been government policy for decades. At Meteetsa, the kill site sat inside a basin where the ferret colony had gone undetected for years. No formal count-on record, no tracks filed with any agency, no range survey that had confirmed them alive. Across the broader Powder River Basin, a decades-long poisoning campaign had reduced sprawling prairie dog towns to scattered, isolated islands too far apart to sustain a predator moving between them. In Kansas, no confirmed wild sighting had been recorded for a generation. South Dakota carried the same silence, and so did Nebraska. State after state functionally erased without a single recovery plan in place. The prairie looked intact because nobody had been counting what was missing from it. That is a different kind of loss, one that does not announce itself until the absence becomes permanent. Prairie dog towns had once covered millions of acres across the northern Great Plains. By the time Shep made his find, what remained were fragments. isolated enough that a ferret moving between them faced open ground with nowhere to shelter and nothing to eat. When the field team finally reached Mitietse after Shep's discovery, they did not find a healthy remnant quietly holding on. They found a colony compressed into terrain too small, ringed by a prey base that had already been hollowed out. The colony was surviving. But surviving is not the same as stable, and stable is not the same as recoverable. Those are three different thresholds, and the Mitietse group was only clearing the first one. Then, within a few seasons of the field team's arrival, disease moved through the prairie dog towns that remained. The prey base did not thin, it collapsed, and the ferrets, already compressed, had nowhere left to absorb the blow. What the program's field team recorded next was a count that should not have been possible, a number so far below any viable threshold that the recovery math stopped working on paper. How those 18 individuals were turned into a living gene pool is the question the captive program now had to answer. The paperwork said the search was finished, not paused, not suspended. Finished federal wildlife managers had closed the file, signed the declaration, and moved on to other species with other problems. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch, and I have spent enough time inside bureaucratic extinction decisions to know what that closure actually means. Not that the animal is gone, but that the framework built to find it has stopped looking. Years of structured survey effort, transects walked, spotlights run, traps set on mapped grids, had returned nothing. So the official conclusion followed the data. Absence of evidence became evidence of absence. Then Shep walked home. What every structured program had failed to locate across years of effort. A single ranch dog resolved in one night on land nobody had designated as habitat. The hog ranch carried no protected status, no survey flag, no formal designation of any kind. John and Lucille Hogg reported what Shep had brought them. Biologists arrived at Mitietse and found something the Extinction Declaration had not accounted for. A living remnant, small and stressed, but breathing. The animal had not survived inside any boundary drawn to protect it. It had survived outside everyone, on a working ranch, in undesignated terrain, invisible to every model built to locate it. Three things had to be true simultaneously for any of this to matter. The hogs had to notice what Shep brought back. They had to report it to the right people, and someone had to believe them and send biologists fast enough. All three happened, and that chain of coincidence, a dog's instinct, a rancher's curiosity, a phone call made instead of ignored, is the only reason the captive program had anything at all to work with. The lesson the agencies drew afterward was not that their surveyors were careless. It was harder than that. The animal had simply lived in a way that no management model had predicted. And the captive breeding program that inherited those few survivors would discover within a few years just how much the wild had already taken from them genetically before anyone knew to look. Canine distemper does not negotiate. It moves through a colony the way fire moves through dry grass. Contact, collapse, contact again. And by the time the field team at Mitietse understood what was burning through the population, there was no buffer left to lose. The decision to pull every surviving individual from the wild was not made lightly. It was made because the alternative was watching the species die in place while managers debated the risk of captivity. I am Dr. Raymond Finch, and I've watched that debate happen before. Always too long, always too careful, always too late. This time they moved. Every surviving individual was live trapped and transferred to a captive breeding facility, and the count when the last trap closed was 18 animals. That was not a setback figure. That was the whole species indoors under fluorescent light. Every gene the lineage still carried was now inside that one facility. Every possibility of a future the species could build depended on what those 18 founders did next. Biology, given space, does not wait for permission. Litters came. Survival rates climbed. Within a few years, the captive population had grown far enough that managers could begin asking a question they had not dared ask at the start. Where do we put them back? Reintroduction went into prairie dog colonies across the historic range. Sites chosen for burrow density, colony size, and relative isolation from developed ground. The plan was careful, mapped, bounded by fence lines on paper. Then the ferrets rewrote the plan. They did not simply occupy the colonies, they restructured them, hunting in patterns that redistributed pressure across burrow networks, which shifted soil turnover, which changed the grassland surface in ways that spread past every boundary the site assessments had drawn. Some reintroduced populations bred faster than recovery projections had allowed for. Others moved into terrain the site assessments had rated as marginal and held there anyway. The system did not stay inside the plan. It exceeded it. What no model had fully accounted for was this. A predator, returning to a system it shaped over thousands of generations, is not re-entering that system. It is resuming a conversation the landscape never forgot how to have. The recovery held, unevenly, imperfectly, in ways that still confound the projections. But some reintroduced populations are now producing offspring that have never known captivity, moving through ground their founders never touched. What that means for the long-term genetic corridor built from just 18 individuals is still being written in the field notes. The field notes from the most recent reintroduction sites do not read like a rescue document. They read like a ledger of debts being repaid, burrow density rising, grassland soil structure loosening, colony pressure redistributing across terrain that had been holding its breath for 40 years. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I have spent a long time watching bureaucracies sign paperwork that says a thing is gone. And I've watched the land quietly disagree. What happened outside Meeteetse was not an exception to that pattern. It was the pattern made visible by one working dog on one ordinary morning. The underlying prairie dog colonies had survived, reduced, fragmented, pressed hard by plague and conversion, but intact enough in structure that when the missing predator returned, the relationship re-engaged, not rebuilt, re-engaged. The prairie remembered the wait. That reception required 3 conditions to hold simultaneously. Enough active prairie dog acreage to sustain hunting pressure, enough genetic diversity in the reintroduced founders to absorb early losses, and enough corridor between sites to allow the populations to behave as one. All 3 held, imperfectly, unevenly, in ways that surprised the field teams as often as they satisfied them. Reintroduced ferrets have now been documented in multiple states across the historic shortgrass range. That is not a projection. Those are verified site records. What no recovery model had cleanly resolved was this. Several reintroduced populations began outpacing their own prey base within 2 breeding seasons, forcing dispersal into terrain rated marginal by every site assessment written before the release. The ferrets ignored the assessment. They followed the colonies. A working ranch dog found what a federal program had declared impossible. And the prairie received the missing piece back, as though it had been waiting for exactly that. That is not sentiment, that is physics. The pressure lifted. The mechanism ran. Drop your region in the comments and name one species you have personally watched disappear from that land in your lifetime. And yes or no in the comments. Have you ever seen something come back that you were certain was gone for good? Because if the answer is yes, I want to hear that story. Share this with someone who still believes the damage is permanent, because the evidence from this one short grass valley says otherwise. The next film goes to Yellowstone, where grey wolves reintroduced in 1995 triggered a trophic cascade that physically altered the course of rivers. The US Fish and Wildlife Service opposed that reintroduction for years on livestock predation grounds, and the ecological outcome exceeded every projection made against it. What remains unresolved is whether the wolves stabilized the elk population or simply redistributed the grazing pressure onto ground nobody had instrumented.